Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for our virtual Rebel Recharge lecture. I'm Gabrielle Engel, a proud 2010 Boyd School of Law alumna and your UNLV Alumni Association president. It is always my honor to personally welcome each of you here today, but today is extra special because we're in the middle of Women's History Month, which is a time to commemorate and encourage the study, observance, and celebration of the vital role of women in American history. Before we begin, I would also like to give a special welcome and thanks to Blake Douglas, Associate Vice President for Alumni Engagement and Executive Director of the UNLV Alumni Association, and Renee Rivera-Gelfi, Coordinator for Programs and Events, for producing today's virtual lecture. Our next virtual Rebel Recharge will take place on Friday, April 15th, and is entitled Difficult Conversations, How to Make Them Less Painful and More Productive, a discussion about learning skills to navigate difficult workplace conversations. We have a great lineup of engaging and educational talks that we are excited to share this spring. You can see our full schedule of events at engage.unlv.edu/events. Today's discussion focuses on Jan Jones, Las Vegas's first female mayor. It is presented by Dr. Carol Bat-Jajak, a faculty member in UNLV's History Department and co-founder and current director of the Women's Research Institute of Nevada. She is a trained oral historian and has published several oral histories of women in Nevada, the most recent featuring former UPI journalist and Las Vegas bureau chief Miriam Borders. She teaches a variety of courses, including the history of US medicine, Nevada history, historical methods, and religious liberty and the law. Dr. Jajak was also instrumental in creating an institutional home at UNLV for the Southwest Oral History Association, of which she is past president. She also serves as faculty advisor for several student organizations, including the pre-medical branch of the American Medical Women's Association and the UNLV History Club. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Carol Bat-Jajak.
Thank you, everyone. I'm very pleased to join you today and excited to share some of the history of Jan Laverty Jones at the time, her tenure as our first female mayor. So I'm going to share the screen and pull up a PowerPoint. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so I'll be talking about Jan Jones, the first female mayor of Las Vegas, and she served from 1991 to 99, sorry. So let's talk a little bit about Jan's early life. She grew up in California. She came from a rather affluent family. Her family owned the chain of Thrifty Mart grocery stores, and she went to public school, and as a high schooler went to the private Marbury Girls Academy, where in her graduating class of 67 seniors, 15 of them were accepted to Stanford University, which is really an incredible statistic. So she did attend Stanford and majored in English along with psychology. Once she graduated in 1972, she wanted to pursue graduate studies, to which her father said to her, "Why go to graduate school? Why don't you learn by doing? Come work with me." And that's exactly what she did. She joined Thrifty Mart, working as marketing, and that was 1983. Well, she came to Las Vegas in 1983, so she worked for Thrifty Mart marketing and looking at such things as what makes buyers buy the things that they do. What do we display at the end of the aisles? How does it impact buying strategies? And the stores in Las Vegas weren't doing too well grocery-wise. They were doing phenomenally well because they had slot machines in them. So her father thought of himself as a grocery store owner, but he was making little to no money at the grocery end of this, but making enormous amounts of money because of the video poker. present in the grocery store. So the last, I never lecture without at least one typo. That should be last. Last comprehensive gaming license ever issued was to the Laverty family. And what that means is the licenses became more and more restricted and tied to resort casinos. And so theirs was one of the last far more unrestricted. So the Thrifty Mart was doing very well. The ones in Las Vegas were making an enormous amount of money. And he decided to let that gaming license expire, which Jan didn't understand. And she said, Dad, what are you doing? This is where we're making all of our money. And he said, you know, there's only so much money one can make before it turns into a negative thing. And Jan said, I still understand what he said by that. So they let the license expire. And at that point, she joined her husband's family, whose father owned the Fletcher Jones car dealerships in Las Vegas. And again, her background is marketing. So she joined the dealerships and helped to market the 3 at the time dealerships. It very quickly grew to 12 dealerships. And at that point, Jan, with her management background, said, you know, we really need to standardize the Fletcher Jones dealerships. We can't have, at that time, car dealerships really, they were independent of each other. They all had their own rules and procedures and protocols. And she said, no, we're getting too big for that. We need to standardize it. So they created the Fletcher Jones Management Group, which she headed up, and set the policy and the regulation and the business protocol for all the dealerships to abide by. At the same time, she was involved in marketing. So she was the face of the Fletcher Jones car dealerships, and she had fun with it. She likes to talk about one of the first arguments that she had with her husband, Ted. And she said, people want to know that it's a good quality, that they, you know, they have the assurance of quality, background of the dealership, adhering to their word, et cetera, et cetera. And Ted looked at her and said, they just want the cheapest price ever. And she said, really? Fine, I'll make a commercial on that. So she got on the air and she said, nobody's cheaper than Fletcher Jones, which some people were aghast at, but Fletcher Jones laughed and said, you know what? That's the first true thing said about our dealership today. And she ran with it. She was very good at being the visual face of the car dealership. And this was one way that she was creating a name for herself in her new home of Las Vegas. Before we go into her mayoral role, her bid, you really need to know how much the city was changing before Jan came here in '83. So I teach Las Vegas history, and you may have various amounts of knowledge about what really happened. We know that gaming hit, and everyone's heard of Bugsy Siegel and the Flamingo in 1946 and all the mafia stories. Well, there's a lot of truth to that. So in California in the 1950s, the California Attorney General, Earl Warren, was really cracking down on what they called gaming operators at the time. And because he was cracking down on them, what they did was they moved out to boats docked offshore. So they were technically not in California, they are out in the water. And they ran their gaming operations that way. Well, Earl Warren was unrelenting, and he's pushing these gaming operators out of the state. So they looked at Nevada, they looked at Las Vegas, and they saw fertile ground for the take. And so they moved from California and other mafia urban headquarters from Philadelphia, Cleveland, Buffalo, you name it, East Coast, and they came to Las Vegas and set up gambling operations here. So that was the late 40s and the 50s. Everyone knows the mafia's influence in growing our town. We wouldn't have UNLV, we would not have Sunrise Hospital, we wouldn't have a lot of our core commercial and really important municipal buildings and structures if it weren't for the backing of the mafia, because While these men could be ruthless in their operations, they also wanted the front face of being seen as good people for the growth of their city. And so they did do a lot of good for the city. By the time Howard Hughes came to Las Vegas in 1966, gaming was changing from that of the mafia backing, where they typically had a front man like a Wilbur Clark at Desert Inn, who they let take the image of, running the casino, but it was really the backing of the mafia. And this is shifting with the presence of Howard Hughes to more of the corporate gaming entity. So we're modernizing, we're moving away from the mafia, but it's still there, but we're really kind of joining the ranks of the larger urban centers. I'll move ahead to the vision of Steve Wynn when he opened up the Mirage in 1989. This is a whole new level of gaming, where it was art galleries, bringing in beautiful entertainment, art. He understood that it wasn't just building these large box casino structures of bringing people in, but you needed to bring people in for some type of attraction. Once they came into your casino for the attraction, they would end up finding something to eat, betting a few bets, and become a part of the gaming itself. So you needed the attraction. And Steve Wynn was one of the first to just go above and beyond to really glamorize what gaming was in Las Vegas. So no more of what I would say more the family oriented, right? Like the Circus Circus, Excalibur, that's being outmoded at this time. So late 1980s, Jan is already in Las Vegas making a name for herself with the Fletcher Jones, so people recognize her face. And the Fletcher Jones commercials were largely tongue-in-cheek. They were funny. She was having fun with this role. But people were recognizing who this woman from the Fletcher Jones commercial was. And Steve Wynn, with the establishment of the Mirage, then later the Bellagio, and going on to create many more elaborate hotel casinos, he really wanted Las Vegas to be seen as a serious urban core on par with the other major cities of the nation. And he personally wanted someone who had credentials. He didn't want another personality to be appointed by the ruling class in Las Vegas. And he looked at Jan. She was young. She was in her early 40s, but she came with credentials. She had a Stanford degree. And he saw this as a potential for a mayor with credentials. And so he backed Jan Jones in her bid for Las Vegas mayor. There was also additional backing. Once Jan came to Las Vegas, she became involved with influential groups of women, both North and South, and this was very important for her later political bid. There was a governor's conference on women that was held every year, and it would alternate between being held in the North and being held in the South. And these were very influential women. Many of them had the influence of money behind them, but they also were weighing in on social and political events that were happening. If you're looking at culturally, where were we? Late 1980s, early 1990s, our state had been embroiled in the Equal Rights Amendment ratification campaign across the 1970s into the early 1980s. So every legislative session, there was amendments to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. It ultimately failed during that period because it became too contentious of an issue. Roe v. Wade was passed in 1973, no small issue, people became, instead of saying equal rights, of course we support this, which the first 35 states did automatically. Once Roe v. Wade was passed, people paused and said, wait a minute, we're in the middle of the Vietnam War. We have all kinds of social movements happening. Congress just passed, or the Roe v. Wade decision was just passed out of the Supreme Court. Perhaps our culture is changing too quickly. And we know that we have a very large conservative Mormon presence in our state, and they worked very hard to kill the Equal Rights Amendment. Fast forward, many of these same women in 1990 said, there's nothing in our Nevada Constitution that protects a woman's right to have an abortion. And this is something that we need to protect in our state. If advocates start pushing back against the Roe v. Wade, we as a state need to be protected. So they approached Jan and said, many of these women were involved in the governor's conferences. And they said, we're going to push for a referendum, Prop 7, that instills a woman's right to choose an abortion in our Nevada state constitution. This was called the Campaign for Choice. And it passed. And the reason it passed was many of the reasons why the Equal Rights Amendment failed. The Equal Rights Amendment failed because it was seen as an imposition of the federal government into the lives of ranchers and rural individuals, and many people in Nevada who were very proud about the libertarian stance of we don't need the federal government in our backyard. And so proponents, including Jan, who fought for this Prop 7 Campaign for Choice, used the very same language and said, we don't want the federal government in our bedrooms. We need to preserve this right for Nevada women and keep the federal government out of it. And that was a winning strategy. So Campaign for Choice did pass in 1990. And many of these women said to Jan, look, there's an open mayor seat coming up, and we think you should bid for this vacancy. So Jan considered it, and she went to the powerhouse political consultants, names we all recognize, Sig Rogich, Vasiliadis, and said, I've been approached to run for the open mayoral seat. I appreciate your thoughts. And they both said, you have zero chance. Absolutely no way. And to quote Jan, she said, I was pissed. They wrote her off instantly. She thought without a whole lot of consideration. And so if anything, that really stirred her up and made her more determined to take on this campaign. There were also some journalists who were very vocal about Jan's run. Ned Day with the Valley Times came out negatively on her bid. John Ralston, who is still an active journalist today, called her a huckster. The rationale for that, Jan was never quite clear, but perhaps it was because she was so well known for her tongue-in-cheek commercials for the Fletcher Jones. So as someone who had a sense of humor, who was willing to just have fun at the family dealership, how could she be taken seriously as a political contender? And initially, she was not. However, there were powerful women who did support her. So I did mention the women who had been involved in the governor's conferences and those that were working for the Campaign for Choice referendum in 1990. Claudine Williams, who was one of the casino owners, said to Jan very quietly, if you choose to run, you have my support. Sue Wagner, who was our lieutenant governor and a Republican, weighed in support of Jan, as well as Frankie Sue Del Papa. In addition, there were more casino owners who happened to be women who also weighed in with their support of Jan. Again, I've already mentioned Claudine Williams, but Jeannie Hood, who was the operator of the Four Queens Hotel and Casino, and Margaret Alardi, who owned the Pioneer Hotel. So Jan had support to run. She ran against Steve Miller, who is a Las Vegas councilman and a businessman, and she won by a substantial percentage. And what did she attribute that to? She says in large part it was the invisible voting bloc, that being of women voters, that hadn't really received a lot of attention from prior politicians because they didn't need to pay attention to the female vote. And Jan feels that this was really a turning point. So in 1991, she became the first female mayor of our state at a very young age of early 40s. I think she was 41. That's pretty unheard of for a major urban center. Why would I have a red stiletto? Any guesses? Jan was young, she was female, she was attractive, she had, nice clothes, she didn't mind wearing makeup, she didn't mind the stilettos, and she didn't mind the painted fingernails. And so this became kind of the caricature of Jan as ways for the longtime political machine to dismiss her. And in fact, right after she was elected, our senator and former governor, Dick Bryan, and Harry Reid called her to lunch at the Italian club and just met with her and basically said, "How did you do this?" So she was smart. She had the women's vote. She also hired political consultants out of Boston who were very good at studying the voting demographics and understanding what voting blocks voted for whom. So she could address potential voting blocks and really listen to their needs and address their concerns. And she did that very effectively. So she addressed some pretty substantial issues right out of the gate as mayor. Number one, Las Vegas in the 1990s was the fastest growing city in the nation. We were booming. That happened to be the year that I moved to Las Vegas, and I remember how quickly it was changing from week to week. Fastest growing city, the infrastructure was lacking. So we were growing faster than the city could keep up with. Very typical of fast growing cities, right? You have something glittering in the distance and it's the new trend, it's the new fashion, it's the new what everyone wants to be a part of. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But anyone who knows urban history knows for a city to remain successful, you have to protect the urban economic base. And so Jan saw a lot of issues that were happening. Downtown was dying. So I put up the image of Steve Wynn's Mirage. That was the new glitter. It wasn't the downtown casinos anymore. And so for tourism, for people to come to Las Vegas, you needed them to visit downtown. If they didn't visit downtown, our urban economic base was going to die. And this is exactly what was happening when Jan became mayor. So everyone was going to the new glitter, to the Mirage, to all the new glamorous hotel casinos that are being built that are not downtown. The other issue that Jan saw was that we had an overlap of governmental services. We had a county and we had a city, and the configuration of what's the county and what's the city, the Las Vegas Strip is county lands, services come up to Sahara and stop and turn over to the city. And so you have duplication of a lot of the municipal services. And this does not bode well for governmental efficiency. So Jan really wanted to consolidate governmental services. Again, the infrastructure was lacking. We had lots of land downtown that was the Union Pacific Railroad land. It was pretty much deserted, but it was there. So Jan had to think of creative ways to renew life into the downtown urban core. So the new glitter was Summerlin. And I remember moving here in 1991, and I had 3 sons at the time who were in school, and everyone said to my husband and I, oh, you need to buy a home in Summerlin. Go to Summerlin, it's the new, like that's the place to be. And we looked at it and I said, well, you don't have schools in place. And I was told, oh, they're going to be building the schools. They'll be building the schools. And my response was, well, I have sons in school right now. I need schools now, not a promise for the future. But a lot of people really jumped on this train, and everything was to be moved to Summerlin, including our urban core that was downtown. Many developers viewed downtown as dying. Summerlin's the new place to be. Why don't we move our governmental buildings to Summerlin? Why don't we move our federal courthouses to Summerlin? Why don't we move our municipal services to Summerlin? Well, that would be a nightmare. And so Jan really had to fight back against the enthusiasm of many developers and business people who were ready to drop any vested interest in downtown and move out to Summerlin. So she had to think of a way to bring tourists back into downtown. That was one of the columns that she was addressing. The other was bring our governmental agencies, and we're looking at our large governmental buildings that are beautiful, that are located downtown, and that was working with the Union Pacific to get a deal for the land, which she turned around and said to county officials, I'll give you this land for $10. How could you say no to this? And they were like, well, I guess we're staying, right? It was too good of a deal to pass, and she knew it. So that was part of keeping our government vitally in the downtown, re-energizing it. She also struck deals with other developers. Erwin Molaski was key. She worked with Harry Reid to build a federal courthouse on what was the Minami Tower. We had a lot of Japanese investments at the time that were starting to flatten at the beginning of the 1990s. So initially we thought that Japanese investments were going to take over Las Vegas. Everything that was commercial was being purchased up by Japanese investors. And once some of those started to flatten, it was time for Jan to move and to create the courthouse downtown, working with the city council to create the law corps downtown. Can you imagine if all of our attorneys joined the bandwagon and went out to Summerlin to establish all their law firms out in the new trendy suburb of Summerlin? If you talk to any of them, for them to appear in court, they'd be driving from Summerlin downtown to the federal courts. Instead of consolidating everything downtown where the attorneys could walk from their law firms down to make their court appearances, much more efficient, much more efficient. So it took a lot of work, but especially Jan's first term, these were some of her basic agendas. So again, I've mentioned revitalizing downtown. Today, we all know that we have the Fremont Street Exchange. That's a tourist attraction, right? We have the zip line, we have every little thing that tourists feel like they have to be a part of. So people will come to Las Vegas and they will go downtown. They want to experience the Fremont Street. As Jan says, this is the largest open air casino that we have, right? Just like Steve Wynn said, you have to have attractions to bring them in, walk them through. And that's what Jan and others, she had a core of visionaries working with her. That's what they envisioned for the downtown. There was roadblocks in their way. We had commercial owners who had retail enterprises, apartment complexes downtown, who did not want to sell off their personal properties. And to make this vision of a revitalized Fremont Street downtown, a tourist attraction, Jan needed them to sell. And so she resorted to something that is never popular, and that is the use of eminent domain. And so that was a difficult decision for her to do. Typically, you think of eminent domain as we're going to build a much needed freeway through, an older neighborhood. We'll buy the homes. We will find, the homeowners will be displaced, but we'll find housing for them. But for this to say, well, we need to energize our economic base, is that something, that people bought as really being vital to our city? And many did not. They didn't share that vision for the economic revitalization. But Jan felt it was critical. And so there were various lawsuits involving eminent domain of the individuals who were displaced because of this. And some of those lawsuits went on for a very long time. Two that received the most attention are US Senator Chick Hecht. His family owned several clothing stores, and the Pappas family owned several apartment complexes. They both ended up settling, but again, this is something that is messy. The use of eminent domain is messy. It takes years to settle. And of course, the media weighed in very strongly, very immediately. And so Jan had to, as mayor, face the headwinds, and it was headwinds from the RJ newspaper that was very vocal about being opposed to the use of eminent domain. And so they would run op-ed after op-ed after op-ed, blasting the mayor because of her choice during this time. So Jan is trying to consolidate the urban core. Initially, as an economic base, the Fremont Street Exchange, getting the governmental buildings downtown, the courthouse downtown, the legal community downtown. So she's working for all of that. But there are also other issues, social issues that were facing her at the time. Her first day as mayor, there was a homeless protest, very public protest out in the streets of downtown Las Vegas. And Jan, as the new mayor, wanted to go out and speak with these individuals and find out what their concerns were. And she was told by, her colleagues, oh, no, you can't go out and talk to them. Who talks to the homeless? And Jan said, I'm going out there. And she did. And she said, you know what? They had valid concerns. We had no services in place for the homeless, and we had a significant homeless population whose needs were not being met. And so she worked very hard to create a state-of-the-art MASH Village Center, giving them medical aid, social service aid, and they actually used one large building that was a former grocery store building. So it was a one-stop shopping, so to speak, for governmental services for the homeless. So they didn't have to go from place to place to place to get the various services that they need. They could go to one place and the services would be there for them. So she worked very hard to address the issue facing the homeless community. Again, very early in her mayor tenureship, we had the LA Rodney King protest, which spilled over into every other urban city, and it, of course, spilled over into Las Vegas. And when the members of the west side of Las Vegas, the predominantly Black communities, were protesting as to the atrocity that happened to Rodney King, the beating by the police, the sheriff advised that a curfew be put in place. And Jan, as mayor, said, no, please do not impose a curfew. Allow the people to vote, to voice their concerns. and their emotion. We need to give them space, and so they did. She also addressed workers' rights. So the 1990s was, if you look back historically, that was a time of a lot of labor strikes, of culinary union protests. And instead of ignoring the workers, Jan, as a public official, did not interfere with them. She didn't cross the picket line, and she met with them. So again, she listened to workers' complaints. And so unlike many other politicians who would rather not address some of the unsavory social issues that are happening at the time, Jan was open to conversations with these various groups. She was also ahead of her time in addressing the LGBTQ gay rights at the time issues. She was one of the first public officials to meet with Lambda. That's the the organization of professionals who of gays and lesbians. And she recognized that this is a critical economic and political block in our community. And I need to meet with them and find out what their concerns are. So again, against the advice of many, she met with them very publicly. She marched in the AIDS walk. She marched in the gay rights parade. And she let them know that she was an ally to them. So when we think of this community today, it is far more mainstream. If you go back 30 years, that was not the case. So I would say that Jan was well ahead of her time in having the courage to be an ally to this community. Before I want to add one more point about the support of the gay community. She mentioned that at the time there was someone who was going from state to state trying to reinstill sodomy laws. In other words, to really penalize the gay community through state legislation. And most public officials ignored this individual. And Jan had the courage to call for a press conference, stand outside and publicly say, this individual is not welcome in our city. And because she had the courage to take this stance, what do you know? Other public officials then stood in line with her and also said, we do not support this. But it took one individual, our first female mayor, to be the first to have the courage and the vision to publicly make this stand, not knowing what the feedback would be, whether it be positive or negative. But she made the call. One of the last things that she did before leaving office was to secure the land that would later be home to the Smith Performing Arts Center down in Symphony Park. So she had the vision for that. That was another column. You know, we needed culture. We needed to join the large urban centers and have a cultural base. And so today, we not only have that, but we also have a medical base with the Lou Ruvo Center and other. We had the Cancer Center, and she was a supporter behind, you know, we're a large city. We need to have a medical community that people are not running from. For too many years, if people had a serious health issue, they would run off to Scripps in San Diego or another major city. They didn't want to be in Las Vegas because they thought that our medical community was subpar. And so Jan very much worked behind the scenes to build up our medical community, to partner with the Cleveland Clinic, which is a renowned medical community across the nation, and really lift Las Vegas in that entity. And also support, as we all know and love now, that we have an arts community, right? So Las Vegas is built on entrepreneurship. And under Jan's leadership, this was supported. in various ways. So now we have a thriving, whether it's from First Fridays downtown, but people love going down to the arts community down on Main Street and 3rd. So really filling out Las Vegas. I remember when Las Vegas downtown was a place you drove through with your car doors locked. You got through that part of town as quickly as possible. And now it's a very chic place to hang out, and people love to go downtown. So that definitely has changed. Much of this continued on after Jan left office, but much of the backbone, the structure, the vision of this coalesced under Jan's term as mayor. So what has she done since? It's been over 20 years. She stayed busy. So she was with Harrah's for quite a while. And then, of course, was bought out by Caesars, joined Caesars. She really took a lead as VP of Corporate Social Responsibility and Public Policy. So things that might not be seen as important to a corporation, but Jan saw it was important to our city's culture. So gaming, right? Gaming has its problems. We have problem gamblers. And she saw, as much like she did back at Fletcher Jones, we have to have procedure and policies in place. So she saw that large gaming companies had to have social responsibility. They have to train their executives, their floor people to identify, is this a problem gambler? Don't let someone gamble away their life savings. You need to have a checkpoint in place. What about sex trafficking? You have to be able to identify. Sex trafficking is very real here. And of course, one venue that can be problematic is the gaming industry. And so again, we need to train those in that industry to be aware, to be able to alert the necessary entities if they think something is not looking above board. And so she really led the directive, and those are two of the social responsibility entities. She's been very involved with our Public Education Foundation, and she's also involved with the UNLV's International Gaming Institute as one of their senior fellows, and now they're executive in residence, doing a lot of work at the Blackfire Innovation Igniter entity, working a lot with supporting women's leadership in gaming and STEM. And she also has always felt very strongly, going the wrong way, about it's not just enough to have gender equality saying, oh, we have women in gaming corporations, but are they in the C-suite? Are they rising? What level do we see women? And she's been working with creating a number of years ago, the Gender Equality Index, working with then Secretary of State Barbara Sagaski to feature this on the Secretary of State's business portal, the Silver Flume, where businesses register to get their business licenses, to take a voluntary gender equality survey to find out how many female employees do you have, so we can start tracking data. Something that I've seen in doing research at the Women's Research Institute is we want to know how women are doing, but we very often see that there are no governmental or business entities that are gathering gender-specific data. And so Jan is all about continuing to gather this gender-specific data. When this Gender Equality Index was first launched, it happened to be the same time when Uber and Lyft was exploding. So we had a lot of one-person businesses registering for their license. And so that kind of skewed the results. So we're working on modifying that and improving the data collection. But this is something that Jan holds very dear to her heart, that we need to really be tracking how women are doing and not just giving lip service to, oh yeah, we have women in our business, but are they rising into management? Are they receiving equitable pay equivalent to their male counterparts? One of her quips that she loves to say is, there are more Davids, people with the name David in Fortune 500 C-suites than there are women in these Fortune 500. So we really need to broaden and be more inclusive and really find ways. You know, living through the pandemic has been awful, but it's also given us the recognition that we can work far more creatively than we have in the past, right? So the former, I would say, put down for women in these corporate businesses is, well, once women have children, then they're distracted with childcare, then, you know, we have all these challenges. And now we see ways where women have flexibility for remote work, for bringing child services closer to the workplace. There are ways that we can address these long-standing gender challenges to make workplace more equitable for all. So again, Jan is a real trendsetter. I'm pleased to be in the early phases with a group of researchers pulling together research to write a book about Jan's tenure as our first female mayor. And we hope that rolls forward in the next couple of years, but it's an important part of our state's history. And so with that, I'd like to say you have not heard the last of Jan Jones Blackhurst. And now if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer. Again, I direct the Women's Research Institute of Nevada. Jan has been supportive of our institute since day one, over 20 years. And with that, I'll open up to Q&A if there's any.
And feel free to unmute yourself if you do have any questions for Carol today or comments.
Carol, my name is Stacy Purcell and I have a comment.
Okay.
Excellent, really wonderful presentation, and how empowering I feel to have worked for Caesars Entertainment and seen her successes, and you go through all of those details. What a magical moment for me to hear all of that, because I thought I knew a lot about her and what she did and represented for all of us here at Caesars and all throughout the industry as well. And where I live in Summerlin, and all of the things you mentioned, it was just really thought-provoking and just invigorating, and it really has empowered and made me feel like there's so much more we can do, and what a support system we have had with the women that you mentioned as well. So thank you so much for your wonderful presentation and lots of details and pictures. I really enjoyed.
Thank you. And I'll share a story that Jan shared with me recently. She said she went out to have dinner, and she said she saw the cutest young family, the parents with the young kids, and they were having dinner, and the parents, they're not all glued to their little phones, but they're having lively conversations. And she was so touched by the image of this young family. She said, oh, immediately I called my children. I said, I'm so sorry if I wasn't there for you at certain times when you were growing up. And she said, Carol, within 60 seconds, I got 3 phone calls back from my children, and they all said the same thing. Who are you? What have you done with our mother? No, you didn't do anything wrong. We are all just fine. We love and support you. No regrets. Great story.
Love it.
Well, if there's no more comments, I would say stay tuned. We are working hard going through our research, and we hope to have that book out in the next couple of years. Jan should be a part of our state's history, and we're doing our best to make sure that happens.
Thank you again, Carol. It's wonderful, wonderful presentation. All right, thank you, everyone.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carol. Much appreciated.
Sure.
A great weekend. Carol, I will be, oh, let me